near your office, and then you can download the recordings in order to review, to hear again the presentations, or to keep the records of your participation on these sessions. We are going to put Mr. Johannes Wiesmann. We have some trouble with his video link. He is rebooting, re-downloading the application. Hopefully will be done in a couple of minutes, and then immediately we start his presentation.
Marco, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
And Pelayo, my message says that my camera has been occupied by other apps. So I don't know if that means it's probably on my side, but I'm not sure how to solve it here.
I would recommend you to close any other program that you have open. Maybe could be perhaps Google Chrome, anything that's open, and just leave the Zoom program running, and then try it again.
Okay.
Again, dear friends, as you can see, with all the 21st century modernity and technology, we still have a way to learn in order to communicate virtually, but we are doing the best we can to deliver these conversations to you. I plead to you once again to be a little bit patient with us. I'll appreciate that very much.
Oh, I get a message from my dear colleague. It may be Microsoft Teams that is not helping.
Yes, it now should be closed.
Let me go to that. That must be it, hopefully. I don't have it on, so I don't know why it's. I went out of.
Oh, there we are. We see you. We see you. Perfect.
Brilliant.
Thank you, Johannes. I beg your pardon for these technicalities. Welcome, and thank you very much for your time. We're going to cover right away. We have about 100 participants, and our colleagues are joining us from Geneva, another part of the world. We were discussing yesterday the introduction of the what is the Fifth Committee, how it works. We have the distinguished president of the controller, and who are the players. We have Shari Klugman from the executive secretary of the ACBQ, and then we're the elected president, the PR of Uruguay, and then the outgoing chair, our dear friend Ambassador Mavroyanis from Cyprus. So it was very interested session. We announced our session, and I see that a very important turnout because it's related to the budget system. So I will inform that this presentation by Mr. Johannes Wiesmann will cover a legislative framework, financial regulations and rules, budgetary cycle, concept and terminology, and overall information about the budget system monitoring and reporting. Mr. Wiesmann is the Director, Office of the Program Planning, Finance and Budget, Department of Management. He has worked in program management and relief operation in several countries from UNDP, UNHCR, in El Salvador, Bhutan, Iraq, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Laos, Panama, He also has been serving as Deputy Director of Budget, covering all UNDP countries' offices. So his extensive experience, I'm 100% sure, will be of use today for you to understand the budget system of the United Nations. We don't lecture, we exchange our knowledge and our capacities to you. Feel free to put comments or question in the chat button in the meantime he's speaking. He will be take care of them at the end of the session. Johannes, thank you very much for being with us, for your time. I know budget has been very busy planning also for all the related issues in the United Nations. I'm going to yield the floor to you for your presentation.
Thank you so much, Marco, for your kind introduction. And due to my own technical shortcomings, I realize I need to talk about 20% faster than planned. I'll do my best, and if not, I may eat a little bit into the next session, which happens to be by my dear colleague Valencia. So I hope to get some credit there. And thank you for starting the presentation. Now, I've been in this job 9 years, actually. I started in October 2011. It's a long time, but in all honesty, the regular budget has not stopped being interesting and rewarding. So I do believe that you're all actually fortunate to join the Fifth Committee. You're joining at possibly the most interesting time in the last 10 years. We're in the middle of far-reaching budget reform. And of course, we hope to continue receiving your support for the SG's budget reform. But at the same time, you are joining at possibly the most precarious time in the last 10 years. And that's because of the availability of cash. We're going through a budget crisis as we speak. I'm pretty sure the controller has talked about that issue yesterday. So to be honest, mandate implementation these days is shifting a bit more towards being a matter of cash availability rather than being a matter of the approved budget. You could even argue that the cash issue limits the decision making of the Fifth Committee to the extent that we are no longer able to implement all the decisions that you are making, because we have to look at the cash, and that drives ultimately the level of resources that we can make available, which is less than the approved budget at this stage. Up to now, and let me ask the support to move to the next slide. Up to now, we did receive more mandates, but we managed to implement those additional mandates without any zero real growth of the budget. You can see here over the last 3 years, budget is fairly stable. In fact, it goes down a little bit in 21, but of course, there will still be additional reports submitted to you in the fall, which will bring the level again very close to the 2020 and 2019 level. Next slide. Now, this gives a longer time frame to that issue. And as you can see, and maybe if anything, just to bust the myth that the regular budget is an ever-growing affair, if you look at this slide, it's not. Any growth is represented here by the light and dark blue fields. That's all about inflation and exchange rates. That kind of growth is a technical matter that does not increase the purchasing power of the regular budget. It's in nominal terms. But if you look at it in real terms, and those are the dark orange, light orange bars, it's stable over the last 15 years. In fact, it has slightly gone down. I think compared to 16, 17, non-post has actually gone down a bit by 15%. And even post costs, the biggest share of the budget, has gone down a little bit by 4%. So in short, efficiency gains by slightly reducing the budget in real terms, have made possible the absorption of additional mandates. And our challenge is old mandates rarely disappear, new mandates are added, and we've been able to implement those new mandates again by efficiency gain, slight reduction even in real terms, even though nominally the budget has gone up due to inflation and exchange rate methods. Next slide. While on the financial side, the budget has been fairly stable. On the programmatic side, which is part of the budget, we had a bigger challenge, in fact. While we could absorb new mandates with efficiency gains, that worked out. But maybe our biggest challenge was on the programmatic side, in the sense that our program plans were highly static, which did not help to demonstrate results very clearly. Our indicators stay the same, were a matter of cutting and pasting it in from the last period. Very little movement there. So we didn't exactly demonstrate an organization that helped bringing about tangible results. And that was one of the big drivers of budget reform. So starting with the 2020 first annual budget, you're now looking at a much clearer demonstration of more concrete results than before. It's more tangible. It's more transparent. CPC, one of the committees that reports to you, before could never see what exactly we produced in terms of our outputs, our deliverables. Now they can with the annual budget. That's part of the program planning. So more tangible results, more transparency in terms of our work, more responsive to emerging needs of member states. Our challenge was that with a biennial budget, the cycle tends to get protracted. Program managers, while not being too involved, rather cutting and pasting last year's plan into next year's. But to the extent they were involved, they had to plan some 3 years in advance because of the cycle of the biennial budget, which has sharply reduced to about 1 year. And because of that, those plans are much closer to the implementation period and hence can be much more responsive to emerging needs. They're more agile. And the annual budget gives you enhanced accountability by including performance and lessons learned. Before, our performance reports on programmatic side were separate from the budgets. They didn't get too much airtime, to be honest, in CPC. One afternoon for the entire regular budget. Certainly, it didn't facilitate to look at performance together with looking at the plans to see to what extent the lessons learned from the performance had been incorporated in the future plans. And that has all changed with the annual budget. You see the program performance right next to the plans. You actually see a specific segment that highlights the lessons that we learned from the past and how we apply those lessons to respond better in the future in order to implement our mandates more effectively in contributing to the objectives. Next slide. I have all kinds of messages. And all together, obviously, what we try to bring about is to raise the trust by you in the organization. If at any time that would be important, we believe it's now, when there's so much pressure on multilateralism, the UN. I think it's essential to demonstrate better to you what difference we make on the ground for the beneficiaries in order to mobilize support to the work of the UN and multilateralism in general. Now, this slide is basically a crash course in results-based budgeting in 30 seconds. It's not very easy, but I'll give it a shot. Starting point of everything really is the resolutions, let's say for a moment, of the General Assembly. but of course also ECOSOC and Security Council to an extent, with special political missions. Those resolutions typically have two areas. You have the preambular paragraphs and you have the operating paragraphs. And in the preambular paragraphs, the resolutions talk about concerns. Concern about sustainable development issue, about too many people being left behind, about environmental deterioration, about a lack of quality education, whatever the concern may be. And those concerns then translate into our objectives. So the objectives come from there. Policies that leave fewer people behind, improved education coverage, global action to mitigate or reverse climate change. Those objectives are linked to the concerns that bring the member states together to start with. And then you go on the other side of the resolution to the operative paragraphs. And the operative paragraphs talk about urging member states, encouraging member states. And at the very end of the operative paragraphs, there is attention to the role of the United Nations. So at the end of the operative paragraphs, you're getting into the mandate area, and that consists of text like request the Secretary General to increase his support in this area. For example, education, to support governments in improving policies that would leave no one behind. So that's where the mandates are born. And the mandates, therefore, drive what we do. They drive the deliverables. And it's for those deliverables, advice, workshops, whatever the deliverables may be, it's for those deliverables that we seek the resources, the inputs that ultimately allow us to produce those deliverables. And those deliverables then go through an approach, strategy, and that contributes to the objective. And as you can see here, objective is broader. We are making one contribution, but obviously the objective, which is about for example, improving educational coverage, the objective goes beyond our contribution. We are one contributing factor, but so there are others, including member states. So objective really is a collective issue. Deliverables is more what we can control. What we then measure is to what extent, and that's the correlation between deliverables and objectives, what we do actually helps bringing about making progress towards that objective, and that's measured through the performance measures. And it's those performance measures that with the annual budget have become more tangible, more concrete, to give you a better sense of the change, the improvements in the situation for beneficiaries that the UN helps bringing about. That's the picture. So that was in a nutshell our kind of log frame, our logical framework, and you find that in every budget section in the coming months that you will review and decide on. Next slide. Those plans, those deliverables, the strategies, all of that covers all sources of funding. In other words, all our activities, all our planned results that we help bringing about are funded from any source. They are funded from voluntary contributions. They are funded from assessed contributions, regular budget, and in some cases even from the support account, peacekeeping assessed. So the plans are all inclusive in terms of funding sources. And what that helps doing is it allows CPC to validate that activities, even when funded by extra budgetary, are compatible with, fit within the mandates given to the organization. In other words, the department cannot start a new line of activities completely outside the scope of its mandates if it receives voluntary contributions. It's aligned, it fits within the scope of the mandates that the GA, ECOSOC, Security Council are providing us. So that's validated through CPC by including all deliverables in there. For the financial side, the money side, it's slightly different. Voluntary contributions are many cases approved by separate governance structures. UNEP takes its voluntary contribution budget to the Environmental Assembly. UN Women takes it to its executive board. UNHCR, refugees, takes it to its governance structure. And those governance bodies approve their voluntary contributions budget. What we provide to you, Fifth Committee, is information on voluntary purposes. The Fifth Committee does not approve XB. You only approve the regular budget side. So while it's in there on the money side, it's not for your action. It's purely for information purposes. And there's a lot of attention now to the XB, to what extent the regular budget needs to include more information on extra budgetary. But keep in mind that this is all for information purposes. It's not for your action. You wouldn't make specific recommendations on it. Next slide. So this is the process, and this shows how we incorporate performance and the difference between the programmatic side and the financial side. So the gray bar shows that we are now working, we started working, in fact, we will roll out workshops on the program planning side in 2 weeks from now. The program proposals, the program budget proposals for 2022. We will start issuing those for translation in March, April. When we finish them and submit them to DGACM, we do not yet have the final 2020 expenditure. They will come out through the financial statements. But that's only March, April, after many of those budgets have already gone out for translation. CPC, ACABQ, in the middle of next year, then look at those program budgets. And then in the fall, you will see a separate report with the financial performance. So while the program performance for 2020 is incorporated in the 2022 budgets themselves, the financial performance comes separately. And the main reason for that is that we wouldn't have the final numbers yet at the time we start releasing those program budget documents. We need to wait. Hence, once we have them, we will separately prepare the financial performance report, and that goes out in the fall. ACABQ looks at that separately, and then the GA, you're looking at the two things together, all the budget proposals and the financial performance report, in this case for 2020. Next slide. This summarizes what CPC and ACABQ have recommended to you over the last few months. CPC was a very good session, virtual, but very effective. Frankly, much more so than last year. 20 programs have their recommendations and conclusions. They could, however, not reach consensus on 8 of them. I'll show you in a moment which ones. And to a large extent, that's because they ran out of time, frankly. Because of the virtual and the silent procedures, days were taken out of the program, 72-hour silent procedure at the end. So they just couldn't work their way through all the material in time, and hence 8 were kind of referred for review to the GA. CPC certainly appreciated improvements in the presentation based on the guidance that they have provided to us in 2019. They do still make some recommendations on improving the structure and the consistency further. and to include some quantities where practical on the deliverables, to put some number. We are currently implementing already on a tentative basis that set of guidance. It's up to you to confirm those recommendations in the fall, and we will act accordingly depending on what you decide. But logistically speaking, we have to start providing support to departments. So the workshops that are scheduled in a few weeks are based on the initial guidance of CPC. ACABQ recommended small reductions. You see them listed there, altogether 0.2% of the budget. Quite significantly, ACABQ recommended to bring down the number of recosting instances from 2 to 1. Only in December, when we come out with the update of the recosting. I'll come back to that also in a moment. And as I mentioned before, ACABQ did recommend to add more details on XB, extra budgetary resources. Keep in mind, for information purposes only. The COVID issue, and that's a little bit of a challenge for us, because ACABQ recommended to include the financial impact of COVID, which is basically what's happening in 2020, in the 2022 budget report. As I just mentioned a few slides ago, that's a challenge for us because the financial impact will not be included in 2022, but in a separate financial performance report. And that's because of the timing of the financial statements. The numbers don't come out in time to allow us to incorporate that already in the 2022 budget proposals. So that's a challenge. The other challenge we have with the ACABQ recommendations is the last one. ACABQ recommended to apply entity-specific vacancy rates. That's a big issue. Vacancy rates so far are based on actuals by each department, but ultimately they are translated into one overall average that is being proposed in the program budget. So it's the actual average that we are proposing, but only one for the entire secretariat. What happens then in the fifth committee is you use that vacancy rate at the very end of your negotiations as the kind of political closing factor. You want to arrive at a number that you all feel comfortable with for the regular budget. You are, say, 15 million off, and then often the vacancy rate is that last factor that you can use to adjust the number in order to get to the consensus number that you need to get to. That would be completely different. We have some, I don't know, maybe 60, 70 entities in a regular budget. Some budget sections have more than one entity. So in order to then negotiate 60 or 70 separate vacancy rates and decide on each and every one of them, we think is politically quite a challenge. And the reason that ACABQ is giving is that if not, it may impact mandate implementation. But I can assure you that when we allot resources to the departments, they are already based on their individual entity-specific vacancy rates. They get the resources in line with their own vacancy rates. So in that sense, there's no risk that they can't implement the mandate because we give them less than their own vacancy rate because the average happens to be higher than their average. No, they receive resources in line with their individual situation. So we don't think the risk is there, but certainly politically, we believe it would be much more challenging for you to have to take on a decision on 60, 70 rates or so. That's obviously up to you to decide. I just give my technical 2 cents to illustrate the matter. Next slide. And this is more specifically what CPC came up with, and that last paragraph focuses on COVID. You will probably be equally interested in what's happening in terms of the impact of COVID on our program's implementation in 2020 and our finances. We will give you updates in the fall on such impact. And the good news in all this is the regulations allow us to modify our work, our deliverables, as long as we stay within the broad scope of the objectives and the overall strategies, and to report afterwards on what modifications, what changes we made. So we don't need to issue a new 2021 budget because of COVID. The regulations very clearly support scenarios like this, whereby the original plan stands, but any deviations can be made in terms of our work, and we will report afterwards what changes that we made. But we will give you initial insight in the fall by updating you on that situation. There's a little bit of COVID references in the 2021 proposals, but the impact goes beyond that. I mean, those were references that were made in April, March, April. Obviously, much more has happened since. And again, that will be fully reflected in the next budget, the 2022 budgets that we now started working on, because they include the 2020 performance, and in the financial performance report for 2020 that you will receive next year. That's where the details formally come out. Next slide. These are the 8 programs on which CPC did not reach consensus. It's recommended that the General Assembly reviews those program plans. So that will come to you, basically, for any decision you may want to make. All in all, in most cases, this is about some specific terms that some member states feel were not explicitly covered by existing resolutions, by decisions of intergovernmental bodies. So it's about the authority of DSG to actually use those terms, that terminology. This is a big thing, obviously, for member states to stay with approved terms. And wherever that did not take place, there was more discussion, and that discussion somehow, or not somehow, that discussion ultimately did not finish because of a lack of time. And so that applies to most of those programs. So we do think those are issues that can be overcome once a bit of time is allocated to them. We are not too pessimistic. In most of the cases, that scenario would apply. Next slide. This is again back to the funding side. The program budget in December, program budget for 2020 has been appropriated, and then the first and the second resumed. There still is an opportunity. There was an opportunity to add to that appropriation. So together with the first and the second resumed, you see the total appropriation for 2020. The main session, the one that you're now going into, very unlikely that you will still appropriate for 2020 because it would be retroactive. The year is over by the time you decide that or the GA issues the resolution. However, what does happen during 2020, which does not come to your attention, is additional expenditures with respective authorizations. The unforeseen and extraordinary expenses resolution is issued for every budget period, and it allows the SG to spend up to 8 million per year for issues that constitute a threat to peace and security. So that's within his authority. The same resolution also allows us to go to ACABQ to seek resources for urgent Human Rights Council resolutions. We won't go to you. It stays with ACABQ as per the resolution, as per the UEE, Unforeseen Extraordinary Expenses Resolution. So ACABQ has the delegated authority from you to give us commitment authorities for those amounts. Now, the challenge for us, obviously, is that neither the SG unforeseen nor ACABQ commitment authority provide any appropriations during this year. Hence, no assessment, hence no cash. The appropriations only come in the fall of next year when you get the performance report for 2020. So there's a significant delay factor there in terms of our cash availability, and that's why the working capital exists, a cash reserve. The problem is, because of the arrears on the assessed contributions, the working capital reserve is used to cover those arrears, and hence there's no additional reserve to cover these kind of expenditures. So it just adds to the pressure. And what certainly adds to the pressure, and this is something you can make a decision on, is we are going to make, most likely in the fall, proposals for subventions to the special courts in Sierra Leone, in Cambodia, which are supposed to be funded by voluntary funding, but in the absence of sufficient voluntary funding, the Secretary General then seeks a subvention from the regular budget to bail out those operations, to make sure that the operations can continue. And while we are proposing those funding, those subventions for appropriation, the GA typically turns them into commitment authorities. And that creates a problem, because then we cannot assess those resources in January, and we wouldn't see the cash again until, the financial performance report, which comes the year after the budget, in this case in 2022, and will not be assessed until January 2023. So there's a long period in between pre-funding those activities and receiving the cash for it. And that adds to the cash crisis that I mentioned before. So our plea to you is to approve subventions as they are proposed, as appropriations, and not as commitment authorities. Next slide. What happens in the main session is not so much new appropriations for 2020, the coming main session, but you will receive PBIs, Program Budget Implication Reports, for 2021. And the reason for that is that the main committees, ECOSOC, Human Rights Council, they still are active after the budget has been issued. The budget is issued to DGACM, and DGACM puts them on ODS between March, April, May latest. But of course, in the coming months, the main committees will still pass resolutions. Human Rights Council still passed resolutions in June, and they will meet again in September. ECOSOC met in July and passed some decisions. All those decisions are after the budget has been issued. Some of those decisions carry budgetary implications, and that's what the PBI process is for. So we receive hundreds of these resolutions every year, and it's up to us to determine, together with the respective departments that are part of the work to implement any mandates that may come through those resolutions, to determine if there are budgetary implications. If there are implications for 21, we will inform those main committees before they adopt. We will then take the document through ACABQ and yourselves, and that then turns into a proposal for additional resources for 21. If it is not about 21 but about 22, a conference in 22 that carries budgetary implications, we don't need to issue a PBI. You won't see it. We will issue an oral statement to the respective main committees saying, if you adopt this, there will be implications, but that's only in 22, so we will build that into the 2022 budget that has not been prepared yet. There's time. So you don't need a separate document. It can go straight into the budget. You'll see it when you get that budget. So no need for you to look at the oral statement. Of course, if there are no implications, then we will simply tell the secretariat of the respective committee that passing that resolution will not have any budgetary implications. That's the overwhelming majority of the resolutions, but there's always a few that carry budgetary implications. Next slide. And this is one of the maybe one of the areas where there is most confusion throughout the years, and that's probably because of the name that somehow was given to it. There is a contingency fund. That fund was meant for this PBI process. The fund recognizes that not everything can be covered by the budget because there will be new mandates after the budget has been issued. And in order to allow for the Secretary General to make proposals that supplement the budget, the contingency fund mechanism was established. And this is more or less 0.75% of the appropriation. That percentage tends to be very rigid. There have been years where we proposed less. The GA said, no, keep it the same. There have been years where we proposed higher percentage. The GA said, no, keep it the same. So that 0.75% somehow sticks. Now, the big issue here is the misleading element of the name fund. It is not a fund in financial terms. There's no money. It's purely a political concept. It's a political margin recognizing that there will be new mandates after the budget has been issued, for which there needs to be an opportunity to make funding proposals. Politically, member states then say, we feel that should be in the order of or not exceed 0.75%. That's a political acceptance in terms of how much more money can you propose to us. But it doesn't come with any assessment, with any cash. There's no actual money. It's a political ceiling. Now, the challenge, of course, is that over the last few years, more mandates were issued than that 0.75% in terms of mandates with budget implications. The GA then, in all cases, simply appropriated additional money, and that's where the funding comes in. The funding only comes from appropriation, not from the contingency fund. Once they appropriate, that's where it's funded. So the GA then appropriated the full contingency fund, but it kept appropriating above the contingency fund level, simply by no longer referring to the contingency fund. So the new mandates got their funding, even though they exceeded the contingency fund. But that always makes for a difficult discussion in the Fifth Committee, because if you look at the letter, there shouldn't even be proposals beyond the level of the contingency fund, upon which the Secretary General says, well, it's very difficult for me to decide which mandates have a higher priority and I will fit into the fund, and which mandates I simply will not do because I exceed the fund. That's impossible. In the past, we had little flags. Activities were flagged as high priority, low priority, and at that point, the SG could say, well, then I'm not going to do the low priority activities. However, the General Assembly abolished those markers of high priority, low priority. So for us, every mandate is the same. They're all equally important. Impossible for the SG to decide which mandate is less important than the other. Those are member state mandates. We need to give them equal importance. So it's a bit of a complicated issue. It comes back every year. Practically speaking, it works. Theoretically, there is some tension with the concept because of the level and because of the fact that more mandates are approved recently than the level allows. Next slide. In terms of PBI, and you may know this to the extent that Fifth Committee is coordinating with your colleagues in the other committees, the working definitions that have been established over the years are what you see there. For us, once we get these mandates at the end of the operative paragraphs in the resolutions, as I mentioned before, if those marching orders include language that requests DSG to submit a new report, to establish a new capacity to support, to carry out a new activity, to expand the scope, approve, decide, anything that's strong, we say that's a marching order, we have no choice. If there are implications on the budget side, we will bring them to your attention. However, if resolution texts are less clear in terms of a definite marching order, and for example, they talk about continue to report on, not very clear that this is a new activity or an expansion, it's a continuation of something you're already doing. Maintain the capacity, more of a continuation. Make efforts to carry out is interpreted as within existing capacity, we make maximum efforts. Explore options to expand. They're not saying do it, it's explore options. Anything that uses words like call upon, invites, encourages is interpreted as we'll make our maximum efforts within our existing capacity and resources. So no request for additional resources. Of course, to the extent that the capacity does not allow, we will not do it. You can't have it both ways. Not have budget implications, but still expect a guarantee that new activities will take place. If you say make efforts to carry out new activities, you should accept that it is possible that we simply do not have the capacity to carry out new activities. We made the effort, but we cannot. If you want to guarantee that the new activities take place, you would need to say request the SG to carry out, but then there will be budget implications. That's in a nutshell our framework on how we analyze new resolutions and determine whether there are PBIs or not. Next slide. So what can you expect in the fall that we already know? There may be more PBIs because of resolutions that come out of the main committees that they haven't met on yet, that comes later. But what we do know already is that we already have gathered quite a few decisions by the Human Rights Council with budget implications that will all go into a revised estimates document you will get later this year. ECOSOC met in July and made a few decisions. They will soon meet again, and they will look again at some issues that they have deferred earlier on. So there may be implications coming out of ECOSOC decisions, which will lead to revised estimates. There may be new decisions by the Security Council, that's mainly on the special political missions, or by the GA. Next slide. There will be progress reports on construction projects in Geneva, Addis, Bangkok, Nairobi, Santiago, and on flexible workspace at the UN headquarters. All those are typically presented in the fall because given the nature of those projects, the closer you are to implementation, the more accurate your numbers become. You could argue, why don't you put a preliminary number already in the budget? So it's less piecemeal, it's more comprehensive. We have tried that 1 year. Amended not to do it. GA endorsed the recommendation of HCABQ. Hence, they are not in the initial budget as preliminary estimates. They come later as more precise estimates additional to the budget in separate reports. You will then see in the fall the next progress report on Umoja, the Enterprise Resource Planning Project, and you will see in December an update of the recosting. This is all about exchange rate, inflation, vacancy rate, etc. I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. Next slide. So before, we used to have 4 instances of recosting. We had it when the budget was issued, just before approving the budget, the first performance report, the second performance report. Annual budgets, the reform has brought that down to only 2 instances. You will see in the proposed program budget some initial estimates for inflation, preliminary, and you'll see updates on all that, including rates of exchange, vacancy rates, use of entitlements for post, in December in the form of a revised a technical revision to the budgets. These are technical factors. There's no managerial discretion in this. This is about exchange rates, inflation, use of entitlements, actual vacancy rates. That's the recosting methodology. Now, you could argue, why are you doing this at all? Peacekeeping, for example, does not have this separate recosting issue, and it's a complicated issue, obviously. It's not that peacekeeping does not have to budget for these factors. Inflation affects peacekeeping as much as the regular budget. Same with exchange rates, same with vacancy rates, same with use of entitlements. It's just not presented separately. It's embedded in the amounts. That works for peacekeeping because the amounts, are much larger, a little bit more flexibility to adjust during the budget period. In the case of the regular budget, it's presented distinctly. I think it makes for more transparency in the case of the regular budget. You know exactly how much is technical and how much is real. I think that helps decision making, rather than incorporating all of that in one and the same number. So what ACABQ now recommends is a further simplification to bring it down to only one instance of recosting and only do it in December, the one you see there at bottom right. So no longer include preliminary recosting in the published budget, just do it once in December. We actually proposed that once. We think it's a good idea. The GA at that time did not endorse it. We hope that this time around, actually the GA goes along with ACABQ on this. We think it makes sense. Of course, the initial budget then is a little bit further from the final number because you get it later on as an addition, right? So in that sense, there's a bit less comprehensiveness in the original budget. But on the other hand, it's the numbers that we put in the initial budget are superseded anyways. So you might as well only present it when the final numbers are known. It simplifies the process. Next slide. Yep, thank you. So this is what recosting then boils down to. We are looking at actual payroll and allowances. Actual payroll because of step increases. We look at the past to project for the future, but the reality can always be slightly different. We look at the past for allowances. To what extent did people use certain entitlements, education grant, for example, but the future may be slightly different. The past makes for the best projection possible. Post-adjustment is something that comes from ICSC. We make a projection based on inflation, exchange rates, but reality could be slightly different. Actual vacancy rate, we look at the past, reality could be slightly different. This is an effort to project as carefully as we can. Now, for posts, if the reality is slightly different than what we project, we may, at the time of the financial performance report, come back to you if our costs exceed the appropriation that you made. And that's because the GA approves not just money. You approve two things. You approve the money and you approve a staffing table. The staffing table tells us exactly how many posts at which level we are authorized to fill or to continue. That's a decision by the GA. Once you approve that staffing table, the actual cost of that staffing table to an extent is out of our hands. We cannot decide on post adjustment. That comes out of the whole ICSC machinery. That's a given. It's a technical factor for us. If for whatever reason the post adjustments go up, we won't be able to fund the staffing table. Hence, we may come back to you at the time of the financial performance report for an additional appropriation, or the other way around. We give money back, depending on how it goes. For non-posts, whatever you give us in December, our commitment is to live with it. Any further adjustments are on us in terms of the risks. One gigantic, sorry to beat our own drum, but we feel it's a very significant improvement in our recosting, is the assumptions on inflation and exchange rates. In the past, our assumptions were oversimplifications. We assumed that in Geneva, all budgets would be spent in Swiss francs. The reality is very different. Geneva actually spends more in dollars than in Swiss francs. But nevertheless, because the assumption was everything is spent in Swiss francs, we adjusted for the exchange rate dollar-Swiss franc. But if they spend half their budget in dollars, there should not be any adjustment for exchange rates because they spend it in dollars, the same currency as the budget is approved in. So we are now looking at the actual expenditure levels 2-3 years back, and we adjust the exchange rates exactly how they tend to spend the money in the past, which is not only Swiss franc and dollars, it could be euros, it could be beer, it could be Lebanese pounds, it could be anything. So depending on the actual spending pattern, we make a technical adjustment for the future, which makes for much more accurate recosting numbers. And with that, we don't simply apply the inflation of the respective duty station. We apply the inflation that comes with a currency that they spend the money in. So if half of the budget is spent in dollars, for that half we apply the inflation for the US, etc. So the level of refinement of recosting has gone up very significantly with the annual budget, which is obviously a good thing. It makes for better numbers, closer to reality. Next slide. Last slide. If you think you just went through a lot of information, brace yourselves. This is what you're going to receive or have received already. It's massive, the amount of information that's available in order for you to decide on the regular budget. You have our 60 budget reports, 40 supplementary reports, 20 HCABQ reports, the CPC report, and you have 3,000 questions and responses from HCABQ. That number has tripled over the last few years. A sharp increase in the number of questions that we got from HCABQ. What then happened is that you, as fifth committee, added yet another 800, 900 questions. So the volume became such that the GA then and you decided to make available the responses that we provide to HCABQ immediately to you. So you have those 3,000, they're now 2,000 something, but by the end of the year, we project it will go up to 3,000 responses. You have them available, and there's so much information in there. We hope that with that, the number of yet additional questions by the fifth committee itself will reduce because it's already covered by what we responded to HCABQ. So that would help. You have it available already. You don't need to wait for yet more responses in the process. Therefore, we believe that was a good decision by the GA. We hope it holds. In addition to that, to facilitate you navigating through all this information, in the fourth quarter, we will go live with results.un.org. You will see all the program plans in there with filters by country, filters by theme, filters by SDG. So you can navigate through all that information on our program plans as you wish to facilitate accessibility. And the same for the money side. There will be a budget information portal that allows you to dice and slice the numbers as you wish. You can build scenarios, what happens with the budget if I decide on a 1% reduction in something. So that's going to be available to you as a new feature with this coming budget in the fall. So that concludes my information. Obviously, the challenge with this last slide is, if you look at the last few nights before Christmas, you'll realize that the ultimate decision-making it's very difficult to base it on so much information. It all boils down to, you know, broader brushstrokes. And that, I think, is a bit of, in a nutshell, the challenge of the fifth. Well, ultimately, the time and the political realities take over at the very last instance. You still try to link it to this massive amount of information you received earlier to base your policy lines on. That's not an easy task, obviously. And yeah, I look forward to supporting you in that process. Thank you very much, Marco. I leave it there. I'm slightly over time, I know, let alone Q&A, but that's where we are. Thank you. I cannot hear you, but maybe on me.
I forgot to unmute myself. This is a good thing about this process, that you can unmute yourself and not bother the others. So thank you very much. It was a very comprehensive presentation, a lot of information on it. My other advice for dear colleagues not to be afraid of it, about these thousands of reports and comments that you saw in the latest slide. Johannes will be there all the time, and they will be able to debrief you, the whole team on the budget and planning staff of the Secretariat is always at hand. You heard yesterday that there are 3 sessions, the regular sessions and 2 resume sessions next year. So don't feel that this is a paramount amount of work. You will be get used to it very easily. There is a lot of reading to do, and I guess Johannes show you very graphically what is important. The next session is devoted to drafting resolution, but he mentioned a very important topic is the process of the PBIs. So I'm sure Valencia will cover all that, but pay attention to it, because it's more or less the core work that you do, which is considering you are the most important people producing a policy in the United Nations on financial matters, and you do that through resolutions. So thank you, Johannes, for doing that. I have a question for you, and I will beg Valencia to give us a second, because you mentioned the report on financial performance, and I have a question about that. The question is very basic. Who prepares such a report, and what is the mechanism for its recommendation? I mean, who does this? How say this? Who is the one who considers these recommendations that comes in the report for financial performance, and who prepared that report? Could you address that briefly, Johan?
Absolutely, Marco. Thank you very much. Initially, can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Initially, the Secretary General had suggested to make the financial statements the vehicle and include recommendations on any additional appropriation or returning appropriation, to have a separate financial performance report. So that's what we will do. The GA endorsed that recommendation. So it's the budget division that will use the information of the financial statements to prepare the financial performance report that will come out for 2020 next year in the fall. So that will go through ACABQ to the Fifth Committee. We will make recommendations on the final appropriation level, basically. We will seek to appropriate any use of unforeseen commitment authorities, but also take into account actual expenditure on everything else. So there's pluses and minuses, and we have to see what final number we come to. That final number will then either represent a request for an additional appropriation or a recommendation to reduce the appropriation and return the money to member states, depending on where we end. So that's a separate performance report in the fall of 21 that you will look at together with the proposed program budget for 22 in the fall of 21. You're on mute still, sorry.
So your last one, because I consider very appropriate, because the situation in which we are now, and that's what we are doing these learning sessions through Zoom and to webinars. Can you tell us a little bit more, in a very synthetic way, the UN reserve budget and its structure? He ended the question saying that in 8 months into the pandemic, the organization was unable to sustain his monthly administrative costs. That was an issue that was addressed yesterday by the controller. I don't think it was not that the UN was unable to sustain its monthly administrative costs, but it was the challenges that they present. So the question goes to, is there a reserve budget and how is it structured?
I'm not sure if I get it right. There is no reserve budget. The only budget is what you approve as a budget, other than our facility to use the unforeseen and extraordinary, but that's a separate issue related to threats to peace and security, Human Rights Council. The reserve is more on the cash side. We have the working capital fund, 150 million. We have a special account that's used as a cash reserve, 200 million around. And that's our buffer in case of arrears. To the extent that the arrears accumulate, the buffer will quickly disappear, because, as probably the controller told you, when this organization started in the 40s last century, the working capital fund, the cash reserve, allowed us to continue our operations for 9 months, even if member states did not pay a penny into the budget. We could survive for 9 months. That was the architecture of the reserve. Over time, the budget has increased, but the working capital has barely increased. So now we can only operate for 3 weeks if member states do not pay or pay late, or do not pay the full amount. So our maneuverability in terms of surviving if there is not enough contribution is very marginal. And that creates the crisis that we are currently in. But because of a number of expenditure reduction measures that have been put in place, including temporary freezing of recruitment, the SG is still able to pay his existing staff on the administrative side. And I'm not sure if that's what you refer to.